So now we'll move on to hear from our featured experts. Now pleased to introduce our first featured expert, Dr. Stephanie Daly. Dr. Daly is an associate professor here at Texas State in the Department of Communication Studies. Dr. Daly, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to see everyone, and I'm eager to have conversations.
Yes, we're so happy that you are here with us. To get started, can you tell us a bit more about yourself and also share with us about how small business owners can be prepared for a crisis and how to communicate that?
Yes, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies. My teaching and research are all in the area of organizational communication. So I study communication that happens in the workplace, and particularly how individuals learn about work and how they become part of their workplaces. And a huge part of that is dealing with these bumps along the road, right, that happen sometimes with crisis communication. And so I'm excited to speak a little bit about some strategies for preparing for crises better. And then my colleague Paul is going to speak a little bit about the responses. So I guess to kick off, we wanted to start by defining crisis communication just so that everybody's on the same page. And really the definition of crisis communication is that it's a strategic process, meaning that we need to think about it before we do it. And it involves managing communication before, during, and after a crisis. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of that before, the preparedness, and then as I mentioned, Paul will talk a little bit about the response that small business owners can have to crises. So in relation to preparedness, there's really three types of issues that crises stem from. So I'm going to walk through these three different issues and share some strategies of really why these things could cause problems if they're not managed well internally through communication, and then offer some suggestions of how small business owners can communicatively manage these issues so that they don't become crises. Okay, so the first one we're going to start with is employee issues. If you go to the next slide. I think I have this one highlighted, and then some examples of employee issues. So employee issues involve anything or things like turnover, bullying, harassment, employee dissatisfaction, interpersonal conflict. And on the next slide is an example. We've all heard of employee issues like these happening, like at Amazon, for example, that when they're not managed well internally, they can lead to, soiled reputations, eroded investor confidence. They can spark protests and things like that. And so there are certain things that business owners can obviously try to do to cultivate a company culture where employees feel seen and they feel valued, they feel psychologically safe. But even with all of that, there's still just stress inherent in many occupations or in some industries. And we all naturally have conflict with others. It's part of life, despite strong leadership or strong ownership. And so recently I led a research team of graduate students in a study about workplace stress and resilience. We interviewed over 60 employees across various industries that considered their work stressful. And we talked to them about various employee issues. So I thought I would share on the next slide here our top 3 preliminary findings so that you can cultivate this type of environment in your business, and you can encourage your employees to do so as well, again, to try to mitigate some of the crises that could happen. So the first strategy is to create routines. So we found that resilient employees create routines to craft normalcy despite adversity, despite these employee issues. So these are things like just basic things that help you keep going throughout the day in a stressful or even a toxic work environment. So these are things like taking a break, going on a little walk, closing the door, right? Offering some physical and psychological space. Meditation apps have also been a common theme in our research as well that people are using on a routine basis during work. And then there's also routines after work that people can do to create resilience, things like exercise or cooking, whatever people's emotional releases might be. The second thing that we've found that resilient employees do are that they positively reframe. So rather than seeing issues that they're facing, like conflict or maybe burnout, as stressors, as barriers or problems, they engage in positive self-talk that demonstrates their hope or their self-efficacy. So, I can make it through this. Yes, this is hard, but this is a challenge and I want to rise to that challenge, or things like that. And then the third thing that resilient employees do is they give and receive social support. So a lot of our participants have talked about how they've prevailed amidst stress and employee issues because of advice or support from coworkers, as well as outsiders like family and friends. And then also being there for others is also part of the resilience process. So again, I encourage you to take these 3 strategies that you can engage in personally to model those behaviors for your employees, or you could encourage these behaviors among your employees, just to help that stress and interpersonal conflict so that it doesn't fester and become a larger external crisis. And then the second, if you'll go to the next slide, the second main theme or cause of an organizational crisis, I've lumped into product and service problems. So on the next slide, there's some examples of these. This could involve things like poor customer service, defective products, software glitches. All of these things can be problematic. They can cause a crisis because they can cause reputation damage, right? Once the word gets out that there's a problem, frustrated customers can take this one small issue and it can snowball into an avalanche. And we know that most people that are not satisfied these days, when they're frustrated with a business, let's say, for example, your grocery store delivers ripe bananas instead of green bananas. Do most people drive all the way back to the store to tell them, I want my $2 back? No, most people vent on social media. They tag the grocery store, the business, and warn people not to go. So I'm going to suggest 2 takeaways of what you can do to prevent product service problems from becoming crises. First, I encourage business owners to have a private channel for feedback. So this could be a cell phone number to text, perhaps. I've noticed this on Torchy's takeout bags, or it could be a specific email address that's included in consumer packaging materials that says something like, tell us what you think, email us your feedback. And this tactic is important because it keeps those negative comments off public channels, which is important because research consistently shows that our communication is more aggressive online. We have more anonymity. There's not as many nonverbal cues. There's different types of visibility online. And so we know that people engage in hostile communication or flaming online, where they don't do that as much on private channels. And so this can really help mitigate those problems. Still, some issues might still seep out into social media. And so my next suggestion on the next slide is to respond to comments on social media. So I see a lot of businesses, I teach a class in social media, and a lot of organizations don't respond to negative comments. And there's a few reasons that research tells us that we should respond. And I'm going to explain one just for the sake of time. This is rooted in attribution theory. And so one large reason we all experience conflict in life is because it's human nature to attribute or explain other people's negative behavior to internal factors. Those are things like personality or their intention, rather than external factors like the situation. And this is called attribution bias. So for example, if you're driving down I-35, we've all been in a situation where someone speeds past you and cuts you off. Attribution bias suggests that typically when we're explaining that behavior, when we're explaining the person speeding, we call them a jerk. We think they're a bad driver. We focus on the internal nature of that behavior versus the situation, right? We usually don't think, that person might be in an emergency. There might be some, really valid reason why they're speeding. So we have a tendency to focus on blaming the internal factor versus the situational factor. And when customers post complaints or negative comments to social media, they're usually engaging in this attribution bias. They're attributing their negative experience to the business itself, right? Their flaws, not just the situation. Like, okay, I realized that, this was just how things were. So when businesses respond to those negative comments on social media, it helps humanize the organization. It puts a face behind the small business. And so that can help customers alter their attributions. They perceive the issue being what it is, usually a situational factor, rather, an isolated event rather than this inherent internal flaw of the business. So again, I encourage you to consider responding to negative comments in addition to that first suggestion of having some kind of private channel for product and service problems. And then the last type of emergency that I'll talk about, or the last type of organizational crisis that I'll talk about, is our emergencies. And on the next slide, I have some examples of these, but these types of issues can lead to the need for crisis communication because they cause disruptions to normal business practices, to the everyday happenings. And oftentimes our tendency during an emergency is to shut down, right? We just stop operations. There's a lot of pressure. We usually succumb to the pressure because the emergency disrupts business. And I'm really going to encourage the opposite. In order to set yourself up for success for crisis communication, we really should be fostering communication and connection during emergencies rather than retreating. And so really the best way to make sure that your business can avoid these disruptions during the case of emergencies is to try to establish communication and connection in your business practices now. And the reason for this, if you don't mind going to the next slide, is that science shows that during emergencies or traumatic events, our body's stress system activates certain hormones to help us cope. You've probably heard of some of these hormones, like adrenaline. Cortisol is the stress hormone. But another hormone our body naturally releases during emergencies is oxytocin. And oxytocin motivates us to communicate. It motivates us to connect and seek social support from other people. If you think about kind of a personal example of oxytocin, usually when we experience some kind of trauma or negative event, perhaps like a fender bender, we have this immediate need to like text someone or call someone. It's just this hormone that's released that is built for social connection. And interestingly, research even shows that watching other emergencies, like watching a film that involves, drama or an emergency, even releases oxytocin as a coping mechanism that we are built for this communication and connection. So before emergencies happen, I encourage you in your small business to try to create opportunities for communication and connection, create a space for that employee communication so that once the emergency happens, your staff is already primed for that, and there's available connections to be used. So this might happen through just regular team meetings, one-on-one check-ins with your staff, and team building activities. You can go volunteer together, things like that, just to try to promote collaboration and trust and camaraderie before the emergency happens, so that again, when that need for social support is triggered, then there's room for that. So hopefully some of those suggestions resonate in terms of preparing for crises. I'm going to turn it over now, if you go to the next slide, to Paul, who's going to talk about crisis communication response strategies.
Josh, do you need to introduce anything, or am I just good to go?
Yeah, I will say thank you to Dr. Daly. That is, those are fantastic insights and some great points that you shared. So thank you for that. As Dr. Daly mentioned, Mr. Paul Villagran is an assistant professor of practice in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. We're very excited to have him involved in today's session. He's also the founder of PR Go, which is a nonprofit, student-run public relations agency that provides strategic communication and counsel to local small businesses. So, Mr. Paul Villagran, welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So let me just start with backing up Dr. Daly from the perspective of when dealing with the crisis. The most important thing to do is to try and prevent it, get ahead of it before it actually happens. I'd like to say we can do that all the time with all of the strategies and tactics that we have, but candidly doesn't always work. Can you go to the next slide? So I'm going to start with this. This is the crock pot. And why is the crock pot in our slides today? Well, the crock pot played a big part in a TV series about 6-7 years ago called This Is Us. It was the most popular show on television, had a very popular family, was one of the most popular dads at the time. In fact, it was the #1 show on television at the time on NBC. And in one of the episodes, the family had received a crock pot as a gift from a neighbor, and they'd used it one night and they shut it off and they had it in their kitchen. And that evening, the crock pot started a fire in their home. And so the fire ultimately burned down the entire house. The entire family was able to get out. They were all safe, but the dad had for a second had to go back in to rescue the dog. And the dad had a lot of smoke inhalation. He was taken to the hospital, and sadly at the hospital, he passed away from the smoke inhalation. I say this because immediately after this, and I mean immediately after this, the audience got really, really despondent and really, really upset that the most popular television show and the most popular dad on the most popular television show had died. And so there were people posting comments on social media, taking videos of themselves throwing their crock pot out into the garbage, saying they were never going to use it again. And so I bring this up because we have to put crisis into the perspective of, especially in this situation, is while you can look at the different types of crises, sometimes the audience gets a vote. In fact, a lot of times the audience gets a vote, and they're going to determine what the crisis is. I say that, and it's kind of facetious here, but I mentioned this to my students as well. This is a fictitious crockpot on a fictitious show with a fictitious dad that created a fictitious fire. But I'll tell you this, any business owner would realize this crisis felt real to them. And so crockpot had to engage in some capacity. So I'm going to walk you through some of the things that they did towards the end, but also through some of the things that we can do to prepare for it. Because if you can't prevent it, preparation is really the next important thing. Now, next slide, please. So one thing that wasn't mentioned was I was in the Air Force for 24 years doing public relations. And in the Air Force, you have to think fast sometimes. So I bring this slide up quickly because it's the OODA loop, which is just observe, orient, decide, act. This was actually created by fighter pilots in the Air Force back during the Korean War. And this was how they went through the process while they're flying missions on how to engage. The faster you do this as a fighter pilot, the better off you are, quite candidly, in this emergency kind of situation. And so the key piece here for us as business owners is to think about time, right? We have to move quickly when the crisis actually happens. Can you go to the next slide, please? We're not all fighter pilots. In the public relations world, we do the RPI, research, plan, implement, and evaluate cycle. It's just a fancy way of saying, find out what's going on, right? Once you have all this information that you can gather about your audience, about your organization, and about the issue, then try to use that to come up with some sort of plan to help you address this, right? Once you have that plan, implement it, go for it, right? Make sure you can do it. And then at the end, evaluate it. How well did we do? Because again, I think Dr. Daly mentioned, our job as professional communicators, strategic communicators, is to minimize brand and reputation damage in a crisis. It's to build brand and reputation in normal everyday operations, but in a crisis, it's to try and minimize that as much as we possibly can. The RPI loop, the OODA loop is important because the faster you can get through it, the quickly you can be more effective in telling your story. Time is one of the key issues to be prepared for a crisis situation. I have a friend who works for, is the communication director for a major independent school district in the local area. And one time, one of my students asked her, well, how long do you feel like you have before you can respond in a crisis in your school district? And she said, 15 minutes. We give ourselves 15 minutes. Now, anybody who works in a business, especially if it's a large organization, you realize communication does not move that fast within the organization itself. 15 minutes is nothing in the outside world. The audience will, their response time is 15 seconds in a crisis. So we have to take our ability as the organization and move it closer to what the audience is doing. When the crisis happens, you'll feel like time moves faster. You'll feel like you won't have enough of it, and it'll feel like it's the enemy. Time is the enemy because you can't move fast enough. So what I want to do is to try and encourage you all to flip the script a little bit. Next slide. If you flip it, if you do things in advance, you use the time when you have it, which is now, when the crisis is not actually happening. You can speed up your decision-making during the crisis because you've done it before the crisis happened. And you can actually make it your ally because now the time that you don't have during the crisis is time that you can use now. Next slide, please. So we talk about issues management. It's really just a fancy way of saying, hey, let's look at our organization. Let's look at our audience. Let's look at the things that we're doing and try to identify things that could go wrong, both in the everyday business part of it, but also in potentially communication and audience engagement side of it, and start planning for those things now, right? And the steps are relatively simple. Identify issues that could impact your organization and certainly impact your audience. Address opportunities and vulnerabilities. I mean, it just means the opportunities that are going to come from this crisis and the vulnerabilities that you have addressing this crisis. How do you look at them now? Plan from the outside in. That just simply says, focus on your audience. What are going to be their expectations when the crisis happens? And then inside your organization, identify the resources. What do we have here? And it's not just your communicators, because in an organization, everybody's a communicator. That's why Dr. Daly talked about employee issues and employee management, because everybody should be a communicator during the crisis and leverage those resources to drive towards your goal, right? This goes back to, I think, a boot. Yeah, that's fine. Just leave it there. This goes back to one of the previous ones where, one of the sessions that really talked about communication needs to be goal driven. Everything we do has to be focused on our goals. Okay? Everything has to do with communication needs to be, what are we trying to achieve? If it's not moving in the direction of our goals, then it's not communication we're going to do at that moment in time. So in a crisis situation, really your focus is on terminate the crisis. Right? When a crisis happens, we start spinning out of control and we need to reestablish that control. We need to try and limit the damage, which means we're protecting brand reputation. We also need to have some expectation management, which just simply means we may not get out of this unscathed depending on the scope of the crisis, but we're going to try to minimize it as much as we possibly can. And then the third part is restore credibility. How do we rebuild the relationships that we may have lost or damaged during this crisis? Next slide, please. So here are some best practices when it comes to engaging in a crisis. First and fast, right? You have to move at the pace of the audience's communication, because if you don't, you're going to allow the narrative to be shaped by the audience. Because again, they get a vote. In fact, they get so much of a vote, they can create a crisis where you didn't even anticipate there was going to be one. So then you have to fill the communication void, shape that narrative. What is your story? Again, expectation management doesn't mean you're going to walk away unscathed, just means you're going to contribute your part with it. Stick to your message. Create that message as part of the planning process. And once you have it, stick to it. Certainly, most importantly, is be truthful, right? If the audience finds out that you're not being as candid with them as you can be, then the crisis becomes worse. That's one of the things I talk about in my crisis communication sessions with clients and with students is don't make the crisis worse. And not being truthful will certainly do that. And the last part is establish credibility, which is your goal, right? Drive towards the goal of establish credibility. Next slide, please. So here's the tactical piece. This is what you should engage. I'm not telling you what to say because everybody in here has a different business. Everybody has a different organization, has different capabilities, has different resources. But here's the fundamentals, okay? When you go through a crisis, to create that message, you want to practice what I call the 3 C's, right? First of all, reestablish control of whatever the issue as much as you possibly can, right? So establish control. Second, demonstrate some type of concern for your audience, because typically in a crisis, especially if it's external, the audience is going to be impacted and you want to demonstrate that you understand that they're impacted. And then finally, you want to try and establish some kind of correction, meaning how do you prevent this from happening again? So let me go back to Crockpot just for 1 second. The first thing they did in their efforts to try and minimize the damage of the situation with the fictitious Crockpot, with the fictitious fire, with the fictitious dad and the fictitious death on the fictitious show was they got on social media immediately and they started commiserating with the audience. They said, we are devastated too. We cannot believe this happened, right? This really hits us to the core, just like it's hitting you all to the core. So that did 2 things. One is it's trying to reestablish control, meaning this is not real, but we're going to play along. And it showed concern for the audience in even non-fictitious situation. They immediately then switched to Just FYI, pushing out a lot of information how crockpots can't start fires, crockpots have control mechanisms, crockpots have electronic safety mechanisms that don't prevent them from getting that hot to start fires. And then ultimately, actually, one thing they did was they bought a Super Bowl commercial with the actor who plays the dad. And he comes out and says, hey, it's the Super Bowl time. Let's get together. Let's have a good time. At the end, he's drinking a glass of lemonade and getting some delicious food out of his crock pot. So control, concern, correction. Next slide, please. And then the biggie now. Time is an issue. How do we squeeze time? Well, one way we're squeezing time down now is how you leverage AI in a crisis. And I am now teaching this at Texas University with my students and working with organizations on how they can leverage AI for their needs, depending on what it is. AI in crisis communication is amazing because I'm telling you, you need to squeeze time down so it provides efficiency, consistency, and agility, right? So it really can save you a ton of time, but there are some cons to it. It lacks contextual understanding. It doesn't know what's going on. It doesn't have that, what I call the humanity piece of it. It has an inability to understand emotion. And during a crisis situation, there likely is going to be a lot of emotion. It has creates a high demand for need for customization, meaning whatever it gives to you, you're going to have to go back and make sure you're the gatekeeper of that information and change it for your organization because it's impossible to really manage that if you don't. And then finally, hallucinations. At least in 2024, AI makes stuff up. Anybody who's used it so far, just know, hey, you'll get product back and you go, it just made this up for no reason whatsoever. And I can go on crisis, on AI, but we'll come back to that. And I think about one more slide. Yeah, so the wrap up. Crisis can be an organization defining moment. Organizations can cease to exist because of a crisis sometimes. Quality communication in a crisis is critical. Go to Stephanie's part. Prevent it from happening. That's my advice to you. But if you can't, leverage some of the things that I've talked about on how you can prepare yourself for it, because it's going to happen, right? Whether you want it or not. I'm sure, Crockpot didn't expect it, but it happened and they had to be prepared for it. So I'll go back to you, Josh. That's my part.
Well, Paul, that is amazing. Thank you so much for these numerous insights, the 3 C's, the importance of time, 15 minutes to respond or less. That's some great insights. In fact, I've taken my own notes here on the sessions today. Next up, as you all know, we always like to hear directly from a small business owner, small business leader. That's one of the aspects of these boost sessions that help make it unique and ensure its relevance to the issues that you all are facing every day. So today I'm pleased to introduce to you Mr. Jimmy Yen. Jimmy is the CEO and co-founder of Achieve Integrative Health. Now, Jimmy, you have an impressive story of how you faced the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, you were recognized last year, and Jessica Schneider is here with us. Hi, Jessica. Jessica and I and some others worked on a program that recognized small businesses from across the state for their resilience. And Jimmy, you and Achieve Integrative Health were one of the most resilient businesses in the state. So congratulations again on that honor and recognition. Can you start, Jimmy, by telling us how you faced the COVID-19 crisis? Because you did it in a unique way, and perhaps what others can learn from your approach when they face a crisis.
Yeah, thank you, Josh, and thank you for having me. Thank you for the recognition, and I've taken a lot of notes myself already, so always learning. Yeah, COVID really hit everybody. I don't think anybody was not affected by COVID. And Achieve Integrative Health, for those who may not know, is an acupuncture and wellness clinic. So when COVID hit, everybody, it was shut down. All the businesses were shut down. My business was not shut down, but the crisis that we encountered were twofold. Were two things. The first one is marketing, right? And so the traditional way, or the way that I grew my clinic originally pre-COVID, was through face-to-face interactions, right? Networking, doing presentations. And we know COVID shut that down. So I could not use my main marketing method that grew my practice. And so I was at a fork in the road. I had to decide, how else am I going to market my practice? And especially during these uncertain times, like people were scared and nobody knew what was going on. And so at that time, COVID really forced everybody, the whole world, onto, computers, online, social media. Social media blew up during COVID. Everybody was on social media. Even the people that say they weren't on social media were on social media. And so, I personally myself hated social media, but because I had no other choice, I had to pivot. I couldn't do my traditional ways of marketing. And so I was like, okay, I got to do the social media thing. And so I started my first platform. I started on TikTok. TikTok was pretty new, and I started that. I jumped on, and that was 2021, I believe, 2021. And yeah, just started posting on social media, and through trial and error, grew my social media following on TikTok to 1 million followers in 1 year, and then started getting business from that. And this is all organic. I didn't do any paid ads or anything. I just started formulating a recipe on how to use social media to get patients for my clinic. And so fast forward, it worked on TikTok. So I used the same formula, did it on Instagram. In 6 months, I got 1 million followers on Instagram, and did it on Facebook, 1 million followers there. And then, just YouTube. So right now, I think when I won the award, I was at 3 million followers. And so I think we're a year out. I don't remember. It's been time is going by really fast. So I'm close to 4 million followers right now. And recently we just surpassed the 100,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is a silver button. What all that means is I pivoted the way that I market. I completely changed it. And now, 50% of my new customers come from my social media marketing. And that was, I thank COVID for it. I mean, if there's anything, that COVID was good for, it helped me pivot to a direction, to a more sustainable model of marketing. And so that was the first thing. The second thing that happened, the crisis that I encountered, was I lost 99% of my employees when COVID hit. And I had 8 employees, and I was down to 1 employee, just me and a front desk. And we had 2 clinics, 2 locations at that time. And so my employees left because they went home. Everybody was scared, so they went home and stayed home. And so I had 2 clinics. My patient load actually didn't decrease that much. And so it was just me, 2 of us going back and forth to 2 clinics. And it was tiring. And so I was like, I have to pivot again. I have to pivot to, how am I going to, I need employees to help me. Well, people weren't coming in to work. So there was only one other way. It was to pivot to virtual. So through COVID forced me to create a new business model for the medical field. And so I created a whole virtual team to run my practice. And so currently, actually every back office task is all virtual. And so now I have a hybrid team my virtual team actually runs my practice. They're not even in my practice. And I have providers that actually do the acupuncture. And so those are the 2 main crises that I encountered when COVID hit.
Jimmy, what an amazing story you have. Even though I'm familiar with you and your business, hearing about it again impresses me all over one more time.
Thank you.
That is, what a great example you are of someone who doesn't see COVID, for instance, as a crisis, but sees it or saw it as an opportunity. And not just saw it as an opportunity, but acted on that opportunity, saw the potential that it had some good things, or the silver lining within the situation, want to say it that way. So participants, please remember that this is